the freedom to speak, because what else do they have? So
Well,
I don't know.
I
There's
think
a lot of insanity circulating around.
yeah, I think to the extent, I mean, to the extent that both you and I weigh in on specific manifestations of science denialism that comes very much from the left, then people somehow portray us as, in that sense, helping the right? So, for example, the rejection of the human mind as an empty slate, like tabla rasa, both your critique and mine of postmodernism, both of our critique of Bill C-16, and the fact that there are, sexual dimorphisms that exist within Homo sapiens. All of these things are forms of science denialism that regrettably are to be found on the left side of the political aisle, and then by proxy somehow we become right-wing nut jobs, even though I mean the only thing that you and I do is really speak about freedom of speech, about seeking truth, about pursuing evidence-based thinking. So I don't those things don't strike me as right-wing, but apparently they are.
Well, that's exactly it. Well, look, the same thing has happened to some degree to Steven Pinker. It was quite a while ago that he wrote that book, The Blank Slate. And when I read that, that's got to be 10 years, something like that, maybe
I think
more.
2002.
When I read
2002.
2002. Okay,
Yeah.
so when I read that, my first response was, well, I don't see why a book like that's necessary. Jesus, it's so bloody obvious that the human mind isn't a blank slate. That argument has been settled and done with from the biological perspective for God. Near on 100 years, I would say, but even more specifically in the neurobiological realm, beyond question for 50 years. With people like Jeffrey Gray's a good example, who wrote the book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety. I mean, we've got pretty damn good at documenting some of the neurobiological structure of cognition and emotion and motivation and all of that, thanks in large part to animal researchers. And the notion, and also it's also impossible that the human mind can be a blank slate, because the artificial intelligence people ran into that wall back in the 1960s, because they assumed that you could just extract out interpretive information from the sensory data set that presented itself with no internal structure. And that just turned out to be absolutely and completely wrong. So when Pinker wrote that book, I thought, yeah, fair enough, man. But like, anybody in the know has figured this out, so that it isn't even an issue of discussion. And then all of a sudden, and it's 15 years later, we have the sociologists in particular and the social constructionist types, like, they actually think this is debatable. Right. It's just absolutely beyond comprehension to me. So it's ignorant every possible level.
I was going to say my thinking, I mean, look, it's easy to attribute their positions to, they're just a bunch of, bumbling buffoons. But I actually think I'm going to be charitable towards them. And then you tell me what you think of my thinking. I think that a lot of the background to the empty slate premise really comes from a hopeful position, right? If we all are born with empty minds, therefore we're all born with equal potentiality, therefore we can all instantiate any life trajectory that we decide to pursue. And hence, it becomes oppressive. It becomes biological determinism to argue that maybe Michael Jordan had an innate set of morphological features and other realities that would render him to be a more likely NBA player than Gad Saad. That is too biologically rigid. What makes a lot more sense from a charitable, hopeful position is, hey, given the right social intervention, socialization intervention, any of us could be anything we want to be. Do you think that ultimately the reason why a lot of the social scientists are parasitized by this stupidity really comes from a good place, a wrong place, but a good, hopeful place?
Look, I think that's a reasonable interpretation, although obviously, as you know, this is a multifactorial problem. But yes, I mean, part of the problem is that there is this doctrine of equality of opportunity that's a deep set part of the Western tradition, and the biological, let's say, essentialism, if we're going to call it that, does fly in the face of that if you don't think it through very carefully. So, but there's logical problems with that as well. So, for example, the people that you're talking about are also constantly beating the drum for diversity. It's like, well, where the hell does that come from? If we equalize the sociocultural context, and every difference is sociocultural, then we're going to eradicate diversity completely, which by their own hypothesis would seem to be a bad idea. They also tend to use biological essentialism when they talk about diversity, because it's always bloody sex, gender, and racial diversity, as if those are the determinants of diversity in thinking. So they're basically sneaking a biological deterministic argument into the hen house. Anyways, although I would say that the people who are doing that aren't known for their clarity of thinking or for their care about clarity of thinking, and so they don't really notice.
Right.
And they don't also notice when the biological essentialism argument is actually supporting their claims. So one of the things that I found really disturbing about Bill C-16, and I just can't understand why its proponents don't understand this, is some of the most powerful arguments for tolerance with regards to, say, sexual preference, and let's say even gender identity, is that those things are determined biologically, right? And the standard claim with regards to the transgender folks is that, well, they're born that way. I'm a man born in a woman's body. It's like, that's a biologically essentialist argument. And the notion that sexual proclivity is innate and unchanging, which is the argument that justifies the rejection of things like conversion therapy, is also a biologically essentialist argument. And those, to put it charitably, idiots who drafted Bill C-16 and the surrounding legislation on the Ontario Human Rights Commission have not thought through the fact that they just shot themselves and the people that they're supposed to be supporting directly in the foot, because they've made it, A, socially constructed, but they've even weakened that. So it's not even socially constructed anymore. It's merely a matter of subjective whim and choice. And it can vary from hour to hour, day to day. So, like, if I was a right-winger, what I would be thinking, and I was smart, and a smart right-winger, what I would be thinking is, okay, people, now you've made the claim that both sexual preference and gender identity is nothing but subjective choice. So if it's subjective choice or socially constructed, then A, I can set up social institutions to eradicate it, because why wouldn't I? Because it's malleable. And B, if it's subjective whim, then I can just forbid it. I can describe it as unethical. I can just forbid it. I mean, it's so
you're using
muddle-headed.
You're using too much logic, Jordan. As we both found out in our respective testimonies and interactions at the Canadian Senate, they're not big on logic, reason, and science. I mean, I was astonished, right? I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to watch my testimony and my interactions. I watched yours with much interest. I gave a 5-minute opening remarks where I tried to argue how there are, many ways by which pretty much anything that I either research or teach in the pursuit of my evolutionary psychology, program could be construed as transphobic systemic violence, to use the words of Harvard, because I was promulgating fixed binaries and biological essentialism. And all they wanted to talk about is how I was, a pro-genocide guy and other, posturing and grandstanding and political theater. I mean, it just shocked me, the level of discourse from these otherwise naturally lobotomized senators.